Who's that handsome guy there, huh?
Are we already recording, Amy and Doreen? Okay, then we'll start. Good evening, I'm David Blair, an active member of New Hampshire Peace Action. Thank you for coming to tonight's conversation series online. New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. We'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. Just a reminder about Zoom etiquette. We're happy to have you keep your video on so we can see your faces and reactions and feel more connected. You're also welcome to turn your video off if you prefer, as this is being recorded. We ask that you keep your audio muted if you aren't talking. Chat is a great place for you to share reactions and ask questions that we will get to in the second half of the program. This every other week online conversation began in July 2020 as a way to stay connected to each other and to continue to sort out how to make the changes in our society that we yearn for. Tonight, we're very happy to welcome Mark Klym speaking on the topic of the 6 Principles of Kingian Nonviolence. Mark is certified by the University of Rhode Island, the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, as a Level 2 Kingian Nonviolence trainer. He has more than 20 years' experience in violence prevention programs and is a co-founder and co-director of the Phoenix Peace Builders. Phoenix Peace Builders is dedicated to realizing Dr. Martin Luther King's dream of a nonviolent, just, and compassionate society, and working to overcome racism and other forms of violence. Welcome, Mark. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Yeah, shall I go ahead and get started then? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you everybody for having me. It was my pleasure to meet Amy, 2, maybe 3 months ago, and maybe it was even in March, on a Iranian nonviolence Zoom cast that went into Iran as well, and I did a little speaking there. So thanks so much for having me. I'm impressed with the number of workshops that you do, or the presentations and the things. And like I said, I'm looking forward to watching the presentation by Dr. Elbissi next month. I hope I pronounced your name correct. So I'll do some screen sharing, and I just put a link if you'd like to know more about our organization. I put it in chat, and also there's a link to a workshop that we're having in November. It's a 14-hour workshop on Zoom, and if you'd like to know more about the topic I'm going to be discussing tonight, please attend. You're more than welcome. So I'm going to screen share and show some slides now, and look to adjust my screen as I share. Then, of course, other things get out of whack. Yeah. Okay, so Phoenix Peace Builders, we're doing that. That's our mission, which David read earlier. And I was asked to maybe give some current examples of nonviolence in action. And so these are some of the things we're working on and with right now. We're working with Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro on doing a community diversion program to address disproportionality, which is kind of a fancy word for unequal representation of people of color in arrests in the prison system. A colleague of mine, Hassan Clement, is working on fit and habitable homes, working with really with groups that are slum landlords and people living in horrible conditions and working with homeless. And he's applying the Kingian nonviolence principles there. And upcoming, we're also working on developing a racism allyship and reconciliation group. So I'll talk more about those things as we go through the presentation. As I understand, I'll give a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then it'll be opened up for a Q&A. And but throughout, I would welcome your comments in chat, and then we could pick from some of those as we get into the second half of the presentation. So I'll be talking about the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence. You can find where Dr. King, and these came from Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his essay, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. I would just like to make note that the word pilgrim is offensive to some folks, particularly around colonization and the way the initial pilgrims treated indigenous folks. So but that's the name of the essay. So, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I mean no harm. Now, there's also the 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence, and that's in another essay. If you haven't read it before, I would suggest looking at the letter of Birmingham jail. Well, I doubt we're not going to be able to get into the 6 steps, but I want to let you know at least there's a pair of them. And I wanted to show my mentors, some of my mentors here. Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr. And David Jensen put together the curriculum that I was trained in and certified in. Dr. Lafayette was a freedom rider. He worked directly with Martin Luther King Jr. during the day. He was at the time in his early 20s, but he's brilliant. And he's done so much more. He wrote some books. He was a key in the Selma movement, and he's promoted nonviolence for the rest of his life. David Jensen also worked with Dr. King in the Chicago movement. And the two of them were both in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and put together this curriculum after Dr. King passed on. So I mentioned the chat. Please put in any comments that you have as you go along or questions. And I would like you to think about some questions about these principles as we go through them. How might they apply? And also, Dr. King welcomed people to challenge his thinking and his philosophies. Now, he's not the originator of these, but he pulled them together and put them to practice in 10 years of successful movements back in the classic civil rights day. But please challenge them. And if you're not sure how they work, or you think of a way it might not work, please feel free to bring that up. These principles can be applied to social justice situations, but what Hassan and I really stress a lot, and other Kingian nonviolence trainers, and we have a network all over the US and around the world, is it's best to try to apply these principles to yourself first, to be at peace within yourself, if you can, and to be nonviolent as much as possible, and develop that. And then the way I did it is then I worked with my family. It's amazing applying these principles, how much better my wife and I got along, And I stopped talking so much and defending myself and listening more. And wow, does she have some important things to say? And then once you kind of develop that and practice that, it's much easier you could be a lion in the community, as I put it, to promote nonviolence and to promote ways. But it's a skill that needs to be practiced. It takes time. So the first principle is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Oh, and I didn't mention this, but I thought I'd ask people to be courageous here. And maybe could somebody come offline and read this first one for me? Anybody at all? And I'm not afraid to pick people. I can see all kinds of beautiful faces on the screen here. Anybody volunteer?
I'll do it.
Okay, thank you.
Sixth principle. You want me to read your screen here?
Yes, please.
Okay, so 6 principles of nonviolence. Principle 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is a positive force confronting the forces of injustice and utilizes the righteous indignation and spiritual, emotional, and intellectual capabilities of people as the vital force for change and reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So that's the textbook definition. Maybe now we can kind of break that down a little bit. And what does it mean? And again, those essays that I mentioned, this one, The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, Dr. King, probably many of you have read some of this stuff, but he's very eloquent and is actually recognized as a philosopher as well as an activist. And of course, he was a Baptist minister. But I wanted to point out that nonviolence is different from being passive. And it's not running away from a problem, but it's also not being physically violent either. And it takes quite a bit of strength to go to that middle ground, to confront an injustice while not getting in somebody's face, but not avoiding it either. And it always seeks an alternative to violence. And an example there of how Dr. King showed that was he had his house bombed, as did several people. The porch was blown out. His wife and children were there at the time. And it was a critical moment in the movement when that happened. And there were a large number of Black people who came out into the streets. And Dr. King was, of course, and the movement, and it wasn't just Dr. King, there were so many other people who were involved in that. But there was people out in the streets upset at that and starting to get violent or threatening violence. And there was somebody in the room and it was in the evening when they came out, but started singing a freedom song. And it helped people to be calm. And Dr. King also called for nonviolence, that was the importance of it. And it could have changed, because an opponent may want to provoke you. And if they can provoke you to violence, then they win because they can use that against you. Now, personally, MK there, that's me, Mark Klym. A way that I've found it, I've had to be courageous, is even talking about it within my own family. Now, I'm a former military member as well. And interestingly enough, I learned more about nonviolence in the military, and that nonviolence is a better way to solve problems than is violence, through bad examples and good examples. But when my kids and grandkids are enjoying some violent games and I talk about it and their parents say, well, it's no big deal, I don't have them shut it off, but at least to talk about what is that doing and what is that desensitizing somebody? And I've got their priests about just war theory. Well, I'm a Catholic by raising as I rose up, and I participate in a Catholic community. I also participate in a Buddhist community and the interfaith movement too, by the way. But there's something called the just war theory, which many of you may know about. And it was developed long ago. And the church often will say that sometimes it's okay to be violent, but it took me some courage to talk up to a authority figure like a priest is to me and say, you know, I don't think Jesus would really go along with that. And that so many wars, have there ever been any wars that have been called out as not worthy, not just? You know, most wars are. So to have even conversations like that can take quite a bit of courage. So I'll ask you to put in chat, perhaps, how have you been courageous when you have to speak up on a situation like that, either with yourself, maybe sometimes confronting ourselves is the most difficult, or a family member or someone else. Okay, principle 2. Would somebody read that one for me? And I'll tell you what, how about I call on one of the facilitators? David, how about you come off of mute if you don't mind and read that
Sure.
for us?
So principle 2, the beloved community is the framework for the future. The nonviolent concept is an overall effort to achieve a reconciled world by raising the level of relationships among people to a height where justice prevails and persons attain their full human potential.
Right. Thank you. Again, that's a textbook example or definition. Now let's take a look at what that might mean for me. And so what it talks about, the beloved community. Now that can be a term some people have trouble with, by the way, especially if they're not religious or if they've had a bad experience with the religion. So just want to acknowledge that, but the ideal here, what Dr. King talked about, and again, he didn't coin this, but he took it from another speech. The beloved community involves not humiliating the other person and not demonizing the other person. It involves seeking friendship and understanding with people and redemption and reconciliation. And he talks about the aftermath of violence is tragic bitterness, but the aftermath of nonviolence is the beloved community. And we've got some examples we talk about, like Napoleon Bonaparte, as I understand, famously said when he was conquering most of Europe, said that it was quite easy to conquer a city or country, even for him at that time in large quantities, large masses of land, but it was very difficult to hold on to it and to govern it and to really have something meaningful coming out of that violence of conquering. And therefore is the tragic bitterness that results. So an example here is that Dr. King was attacked on stage. One time he was giving a speech and there was a man who just came up to him and started punching him. And he fell down, but he got back up. And the man punched him a few more times before the violent person was taken away. And Dr. King had such an emotional control of himself that he just kept on going and just did not give it any credence there. So I would like to ask a question, and David, this is maybe somewhat prompted by you. You talked about earlier about having Gene, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on his name, Gene Sharp, maybe have some contrasts and some comparisons and contrasts. And Gene Sharp was a bit of a more of a not a religious type of a person from what I understand, and I'm not an expert in him, but it's come up in our workshops too. Is this beloved community thing only for religious people? That it makes some people feel very uncomfortable. And somebody like Gene Sharp can be quite valuable to give another perspective for all people. And Dr. King invited, well, famously, some of the folks that he invited, some were atheists and some were homosexuals, which was very taboo back in the day. And he welcomed everybody. So I would encourage people, if people have some chat about that, what do you think about this term, the beloved community? Is it a worthy goal, or would you word it some other way? Is there a secular way of phrasing that? So I'd like to take a look now at principle 3. And how about Gail Page? Would you mind coming off of mute and reading that for us? Do you know how to do that? Oh, I see she's on mute there. How about Sylvia?
Yeah, I will
Do you
read
mind?
it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Principle 3, attack the forces of evil, not the persons committing the evil. The nonviolent approach helps one analyze the fundamental conditions, policies, and practices of the conflict, rather than reacting to one's opponents or their personalities.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, that's so very important. Maybe a phrase people are familiar with. Let's see here. Let me get it here. Are maybe hate the sin but love the sinner. Right? And some of the phrases that Dr. King talked about was that the tension is not between black and white, but it's between justice and injustice. So while as a young man, he did talk about in his writings that he had to work very hard not to hate all white people. But he learned not to make it about white people and what they were doing. He talked about justice and injustice. And famously, he would not endorse certain candidates for political office or things like that, not typically, but he worked on the issues. And you can see here some examples that said it can be a waste of energy to work on the, to focus in on the person, and that can really deflect an issue as opposed to addressing the actual conditions. I could say, like in a personal experience, in a family situation, it might be real easy to, like, say my wife and I got into an argument about money or something, or we had a disagreement. And instead, it would be so easy for me to focus in on, oh, she's spending money poorly or not doing it in the right way. And why would she do that? As opposed to talking about, well, what are your goals? How do you see us using money? And what do you think would be a good way for us to do this? Or we had agreed on this before, if something changed. And then really listening to that perspective. And that's actually from a real life example, because my wife and I, we learned how to manage our money differently, and it's worked wonders. Before that, she's a spender and I'm a saver, and we couldn't see eye to eye on things. But when we dug a little bit deeper, we really could. We looked at what are the issues. And not that she's evil, by the way. And some of this language you'll see, it talks about the forces of evil, not evil. Of course, you talked about confronting racism and the such, but these principles can easily be adapted to one's personal situation as well. And just looking around, talks about seeking equity and reconciliation. And so many laws were changed from the Jim Crow laws on busing and being able to go to motels, voting rights, housing rights, so many changed. And of course, a lot of those are sliding backwards right now. But there was a lot accomplished by focusing in on the issues. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, I wanted to give a quick example of Black Lives Matter with the city of Tempe to work on a youth diversion program. So Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro is a really impressive group. There were, in the height of course, COVID and the such, and after George Floyd died and was killed. There was thousands of people marching in the streets and protesting against police violence and such. Well, it's to the credit of both Black Lives Matter and the city of Tempe, a local city here, college town, that they're sitting down at the table and they're talking about issues. And they can both agree that the unequal proportion of people of color being arrested and going to jail is an issue that can be mutually agreed upon. So both of them were looking at what are the issues and how can we work together on this. Okay, Principle 4. Got somebody might like to read this one? Amy, would you like to do that for us?
Sure. So Principle 4, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to reach a goal.
Oh, I think I went a little bit too far. There you go. There's the definition.
Oh, okay. Self-chosen suffering is redemptive and helps the movement grow in a spiritual as well as a humanitarian dimension. The moral authority of voluntary suffering for a goal communicates the concern to one's own friends and community as well as to the opponent.
Right. Thank you. So in here, of course, many of Dr. King took a lot of these principles from many others, including Gandhi. And Gandhi famously said, rivers of blood may have to flow, but it must be ours. He did not want the British or the Indian military to shed blood. And nonviolent action is upfront if people are protesting and they don't avoid the consequences of their action. Like many people gladly went to jail during the movements and now even during Black Lives Matter to have to protest a certain issue, but they're upfront about it. And some of the phrases back in the civil rights movements, probably many of you know, is fill up the jails, because it would overload the system and then people didn't know what to do with it. All right. Unearned suffering can be redemptive, a lot of kind of spiritual references there. But when somebody else is suffering unjustly, and during the civil rights movement, they did a great job with media, and there were pictures of that. And like with George Floyd, what a spark. I mean, that's a perfect example too. I mean, it was clearly seen national on television, social media, where George Floyd was held down and he was not offering any resistance. Unfortunately, he died terribly, but boy, what an uproar that caused. As opposed to if thousands of people maybe came out and started attacking the police, that would probably have a different story to it. So it can really open up ears that are otherwise shut. And let's see, what have I got there? Is it suffering to listen without defending oneself? It is for me sometimes, because I tend to like to speak a lot and I want to defend myself. And if somebody maybe is questioning my behavior, I want to defend myself and I want to prove that I'm right. And boy, how well it changed situations when I learned to just accept that and accept, okay, maybe I'm wrong, and to be quiet and to do that, and then to listen. So I offer suggestions and questions about that as well. And maybe have you suffered for the cause of nonviolence, for a cause, and to act nonviolently? And what effect did that have? I think for the sake of time, I think we're getting kind of close. You want me to end about 35 minutes after the hour, is that right? Yeah, okay. So I'll go ahead and read this one. Principle 5, avoid internal violence as well as external physical violence. The nonviolent attitude permeates all aspects of a campaign. It provides a mirror type reflection of the reality of the condition to one's opponent and the community at large. Specific activities must be designed to maintain high level of spirit and morale during a nonviolent campaign. I would like to point out that while nonviolent attitude permeates all aspects of the campaigns, not everybody can be nonviolent, and not everybody can agree to do that. Some people just aren't ready, but there's always a place for them in the classic movement or even now. Back in the day, before there were cell phones, some people people would have to sign a pledge in order to go out and march and be part of their campaigns, a pledge of nonviolence. But if somebody says, I just can't do it, well, they can make sandwiches, they can pass out water. At some of the movements in Nashville, and during our presentation, we show some great videos of Nashville, and some people got arrested, some people might have gotten hurt, and so some people would sit back with a pocket full of change and be ready to use a payphone and make a phone call to call an ambulance or something like that that was needed. So they try to work with everybody as much as possible. So Dr. King gets into some philosophies here about what it means to avoid internal violence. And in the steps, which are another thing, one of them is self-purification or self-preparation. And it's a process of trying to remove the violence from one's own heart and one's actions. And like Dr. King said, he refused to hate. He just didn't have time for it anymore. And talked about different types of love. And this is not an eros kind of love, or romantic or brotherly love even, but this is a kind of agape love. You have unconditional love for somebody. You may not like them, but you hold respect for them. Right? And consider, like I said, all people brothers and sisters. And once you know, some even the hardest hearts are changed. Maybe some of you with gray hair like I have might remember George Wallace, a racist governor of Alabama, and diehard racist, right? But he was injured, he was shot. And that may have motivated him to change, and he went and apologized at Black churches and such. And later on as governor, he hired a lot of Black people. And it's not to be bitter either. I've seen people in the Greenpeace movement, in Occupy movement, in Black Lives Matter, and in other situations where they're just bitter, they're angry, they're burned out. So that's a form of self-violence that needed to take care of yourself. And so my question here is this: what are you doing for self-care? If you're upset with a situation, how do you take care of yourself? And in the movement, they had songs, very important. Dr. King would call up famous singers on the phone and ask them to sing to him, and they would. There's many ways that we can do. He took vacations too. So, we've got to take care of ourselves with doing this, and then we're better able to take care of others. So the last principle is the universe is on the side of justice. Truth is universal. Human society and each human being is oriented to the just sense of order of the universe. The fundamental values in all the world's great religions include the concept that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. For the nonviolent practitioner, nonviolence introduces a new moral context in which nonviolence is both the means and the ends. So what does that mean? That helped Dr. King sustain himself as well, and so many others in the movement, to have a deep faith in the future that things are going to work out. To support, and to this support allows an acceptance of suffering without retaliation as well. And I'll close here with my partner, Hassan Clement, who co-teaches facilitates the workshops, that this principle sustains him. And I used to work with Child Protective Services, and I would go into homes where there was just horrible situations. The parents meant well. Usually, it was hard to find a parent who did not mean well, but they were often victims of abuse and neglect when they grew up. And Hassan, he was telling me about a 70-something-year-old man, maybe he was approaching 80. The home had mildew in it. The man had sores on the bottom, of third-degree burns on the bottom of his feet, and living in that condition. And he's worked to put these principles together, is working with the city and a lot of other people to talk to the landlords, and actually got the landlords to work with them. At first, they pushed against it, but in working with the city and code enforcement, which gave them a little bit of a motivation to do something, then the landlord in this situation actually working with them. But the idea is always have to hope and have a support group and do what he likes to go out and just lay down in the desert and just experience the earth, if you will, and the wholeness. So we need to take care of ourselves and to recognize that the universe is on the side of justice. At least those are Dr. King's thoughts, mine too, maybe not yours. So I'd be glad to discuss these. We have an exercise in our workshop where we have people go into small groups and they actually write down, why would these principles not work? And what I can do is put these principles in chat so people can look at them all at once as well. And I see there's quite a few comments in chat, but I'll go ahead and turn it on over to you now, David.
Yeah, there are. The chat has been lively, Mark. Thank you very much for your presentation. And there's many questions. And one theme that's come up a lot in the chat is the difference between nonviolence and pacifism. Could you speak to that, please?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Some people use the terms interchangeably, and some people will use pacifism to being a pacifist, and they mean more of what I think of as nonviolence. So when I think of a pacifist, it's generally somebody who does not believe in war, does not believe in violence, and their way to live that and to show it. And it's not a bad way, but it is a way that can be very meaningful to refrain from engaging in any kind of violent action, but not necessarily confronting the harm that's done or the issue at hand. It is perhaps remaining silent. And if that's what somebody means by being a pacifist, and again, there are some pacifists who take some action, so the terms are not, a little bit fluid somewhat. But one of the things that Dr. King he wrote about being most frustrated about, and in some of my work, I see that as well. It was the liberal white person who meant well and said they support what's being done, but they would not show up for the marches. They would not speak out against it. They would not integrate their churches really, or if there was integration is meant, well, you come over and do it our way. You're welcome here as long as you do it our way, right? And that was very frustrating because he knew the majority of people were not racist or were not actively racist, and they wanted to change, but and I had to confront that in myself, especially when I was working full time. I was raising a family. How much would I risk confronting an injustice and maybe risk going to jail? So it's got to come down to a personal decision. But the nonviolent actor is somebody who takes a third way. And I'm thinking of a Buddhist teacher I had on this too. And he would use visually, it's you're not right in their face, but you don't run away either. You just stand there and you talk with a certain amount of calmness and assertiveness. You don't attack the other person personally, but you address the issue. And I guess I could give one example of as well in a family, in a domestic situation. Say I was upset with something my wife did. Maybe she spent money on something I didn't think she should spend it on. And not that she's ever done that, right? But of course, and there's things that I've done that upset her, of course. So it'd be so easy sometimes just, okay, let's not talk about it. Let's just go on and do something we like. But things like that can fester. Or maybe it's on a parenting issue and we don't appreciate how our spouse or maybe one of our, I've got children old enough to have their own children. And maybe I see something that's not right. Now, there's a fine line between meddling and being overly meddling and being silent. But I guess what I found back again, talking about my wife and I and our relationship, it's so much, and timing is important. Sometimes it's not the right time to say something or to address an issue. But what I found, when we're both in a calm space and we talk about an issue through, we come up with wonderful solutions. And so a nonviolent action, maybe in like Black Lives Matter again, is protesting, but they're not, and they're speaking their mind, and they're going to city councils and they're pointing out the injustice, but they're not trying to harm physically any police officer, say, or they're not burning a building or something of that sort. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. That's helpful. May I suggest that you stop sharing screen now so that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
So that, yeah. And I'll just comment too that for some people, I think the distinction between a pacifist and a nonviolent activist is that some pacifists cannot imagine using violence in any situation, whereas some nonviolent activists can justify self-defense, for instance. Not everyone, that's just another way of seeing that difference. There are many, many questions, some in the chat, and I'm sure that some of you would like to ask questions by right now just unmuting, raising your hand. You can use the reactions button at the bottom to do that. So we're now open for questions. We have about 15, we have a little less than 15 minutes to do that. So please, the floor is open.
David, do you want me to highlight some of the questions from the chat?
I would appreciate that. Yep.
Okay, here we go. How are the youth revisiting and interpreting or revisioning Gandhi? And also the practice of willingly being arrested under new, harsher sentencing against protesters and climate activists. Is the question.
So the question is, how are the youth
And
responding?
protectors, Amy. And protectors. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well-
so I'm just curious because Gandhi, some conversations with youth leaders that I've had have been wrestling with the notions that Gandhi was racist and bringing a lot of that to the forefront of conversation, which I never shy away from it. I just kind of dive into that. So I wonder what your experience is with how Gandhian principles of nonviolence are coming through Kingian principles of nonviolence, and how are youth still gravitating toward these philosophical tenets that we older activists look to, and or are they looking to new and different theories of nonviolence? And how do you work with these tensions around their questioning our heroes in that movement?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to take as many parts of that as I can.
I'm sorry.
No, that's totally cool, because this is a whole issue. And if I miss something, let me know. And I certainly don't have all the answers, but I can give you my perspective on it. I believe it was read somewhere that some people believe that Gandhi was a racist. And I hadn't heard that before. I know that he worked really hard to try to bring the Hindus and the Muslims together. I know at one point that there were some white people working with him very closely, ministers. There was a daughter of a British general. There were several, but at some point, he said, this has got to be the Indian people on their own speaking up and like going on a march. And so there were some things. And I know that there were other criticisms about him, and some people left him. And there were criticisms about Dr. King as well, about sexual infidelity with Dr. King. And some people, particularly the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, some members of them would refer to him as Lordy King, because he was always talking about really high issues and they wanted to get down to practical matters. So with that, I think, you know, we're all human beings and all people have personal faults. I know I have more than my fair share of them, but trying to improve and then try to take people at what is the good that we can take from it. And that's one thing that Dr. King talked about with a Hegelian approach that we talk about. I hope I'm not getting too off the topic here, but Hegel was a racist philosopher from Germany. And Dr. King was brilliant. He read many philosophers. He drew his information from a lot of people. And what he liked about Hegel, he discarded the racist part, but he liked the idea of taking a thesis. I'm trying to get in the mirror here, the camera, a thesis and an antithesis. So what are both sides of the issue and how can you work together for a better good? As far as youth go, it is a challenge within the work to make this relevant to young people. Within the Culture of Peace Alliance, which is our parent organization, there's some people who have a youth peace conference and they're very good at working with youth. One of our co-trainers is a young Indigenous woman, or a woman who is Indigenous, who would co-train with me. And she started some, she worked as a Native Youth Coalition. She came and spoke with me about indigeneity at a community college and online. And it's a matter of having discussions and being open. And I think as an older person, not being set in my way, but looking to understand where they're coming from and discuss issues, and then encouraging that younger person to make it their own. What can you take that is good and what is relevant and how can you own it? Like Black Lives Matter. I mean, they did things differently. Of course, they had social media and things. So that's what I think. I hope I answered some of the questions. And if you have other comments or thoughts, please mention them.
I see that Arnie has asked, how do youth relate to the concept of redemptive suffering?
Well, for me, in the full phrase is it not to suffer to be a masochist. One doesn't seek to go out and and seek pain for pain's sake. That probably isn't healthy. And to be willing to suffer, it was for the cause to reach a goal. So there was a specific calculated reason for it. And also it would need to be after one tried negotiation and perhaps other things rather than put oneself in harm's way. And then one would have to be prepared to accept what might happen. So when there was a talk of a movement, and there were some things here around here, one time Jesse Jackson came out here to Phoenix area and met with Reverend Barber from the Poor People's Campaign. Maybe some of you have heard that. It's an extension of what Dr. King was working on when he was assassinated. So they came out with others, and there were some meetings ahead of time about what people would do. And they asked who is ready and available to go to jail. And most of it, I wasn't, but I was more in a supportive role along with. There were a few who could, maybe a few who didn't have somebody to care for, or they didn't have to worry about losing money or something. And so there was a lot of thought behind it. It's not just go out to suffer for suffering's sake. But the part that can be redemptive from my point of view is that if the suffering is unearned, if it's unjust, and the public can see that in a dramatic way, because Dr. King would often talk about dramatizing a situation to really wake people up, if you will, so they could see a situation, to really get into the hearts, to see the extent that, in their case, a racist would go to, I mean, the hoses in Birmingham. And by the way, the children, there's a children's march movie we show during our 16-hour workshop. It showed how children made the difference. They were wanting, they're often more eager, and they don't have the responsibilities. It was a big concern and a debate whether to bring the children in. But when somebody, when the public at large can see, wow, this not being able to vote back in the day, or having vote restricted, or back in the day of, well, it still happens now, right, where people are killed and there's no reason for it, that can motivate others, and it can redeem them in a sense to take action. And like Dr. Lafayette was saying, you know, when some of these things went to the Supreme Court, there were not any Black people on the Supreme Court when they changed laws and agreed to that, or in Congress when the laws were changed. And they didn't do it because they necessarily empathize. Well, they learned to empathize with the situation when they saw that people were suffering unfairly. I don't know if that gets to it, but that's some of my thoughts on it.
Thank you, Mark. There have been a few questions in the chat, some conversation about Ukraine, and I suggest that we wait a few weeks until we're hearing from Joseph Gerson to plunge into those questions. We have about 3 more minutes before I need to wrap up. And Doug Whitbeck, you've been very active in the chat. I wonder if you'd like to unmute and share one of your thoughts, so that we might hear from you and give Mark time to respond. And again, in 3 minutes, I'm going to ask us to wrap up.
Well, I put up the example of John Lewis, and I can see how that works on some levels, but I am very conflicted about saying you know, about Ukraine, which does turn up. So I guess you said be patient.
I could have a thought on that. I don't mind responding to that real quickly. And I'm not sure what the exact question was about Ukraine, but perhaps it was, how could we act nonviolently when Ukraine is being attacked by Russia? If that was the gist of the question, it comes down to preparation. And Gandhi said, and King realized, there has to be a nonviolent force of equal strength to those who have violence, who would perpetrate violence. And I like to quote a General Zinni, a 4-star general, Marine general, was a diplomat. And he talked about building a corps, platoons, if you will, battalions of peacemakers, and that they could be effective in going into a country. So, I mean, if you've got the Russian forces coming in with tanks and planes and stuff, and you've got, 100 or even 1,000 people who say, stop, don't be. If there was 1,000, maybe that would take some time. But if there were 100,000 coming out to march, or if there were nonviolent actions being taken otherwise, that to prevent a situation from that happening and really taking some negotiations prior to the conflict reaches that. So that's some thoughts and some ways a nonviolent actor may address a war. When you're in the heat of it, it'd be very hard to prevent it. Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that there is protest in Russia. The government there does a good job of controlling the media and stifling protests rather quickly. Any protesters there do pay a price. So there's an argument for freedom of the press.
There will certainly be more opportunity to talk about this with Joseph in a few weeks. Gene Sharp would have lots of ideas also about effective ways to protest nonviolently, even in the face of aggression. So again, thank you, Mark, for speaking with us, and thank you all who came to be part of this conversation. If you want to know more about Phoenix Peace Builders, you can look at phoenixpeacebuilders.org. There's an upcoming workshop. Mark shared the flyer for that in the chat, and you can also find that on their website, again, phoenixpeacebuilders.org. New Hampshire Peace Action has a Facebook site and also a website, newhampshirepeaceaction.org, where you can learn what's happening and what our priorities are at the moment and what is coming up. And I want to mention 3 programs coming up. This Friday, from 6 to 8:30 is Peace Action's fall fundraiser. It features Dr. Liz Theoharis, who's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, which Mark mentioned, the Poor People's Campaign, or the National Call for Moral Revival. This is a hybrid event. In other words, you can either come to the Puritan Conference Center in Manchester, New Hampshire, where there will be food and social time, or join by Zoom. And the ticket prices begin at $25. Again, that's this Friday, end of this week. Our next conversation in this series is on Indigenous Peoples Day, Monday, October 9, from 7 to 8 p.m. And Jehan Elbisi, whom we've enjoyed hearing from this evening, will be speaking that evening about decolonization. And then I've mentioned a couple of times Joseph Gerson. He will be speaking in 4 weeks, Monday, October 23rd, from 7 to 8. He'll be talking about possibilities for peace in the post-Cold War era. Joseph is really an expert on nuclear policy, very involved in conversations with people in Europe, particularly around the war in Ukraine and the NATO, the status of NATO and the Russians. So these talks are free and open to everyone. We deeply appreciate any financial support you can give so we can keep going. You can donate at newhampshirepeaceaction.org/donate. So it's 8 p.m. So I'd like to wish you all a wonderful night. Again, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon, perhaps this Friday at the fall fundraiser. So good night, all.